Hello everybody and welcome. My name is Edda320 and this is my tank channel. I really like tanks, and I really like talking about tanks, and I really like doing research about tanks, so I figured I might as well start a channel about it, because why not? There's a lot of questions and a lot of topics involving tanks that I'm very interested in, and nobody in my immediate friends group wants to talk about them with me.
Gonna cry, gonna piss your pants maybe.
So, this is my way of venting, I guess. Today's topic is the tiger. Yes, of course, the tiger. Everyone starts out talking about the tiger. I know that the topic has been talked basically to death, but I figured this is a good neutral starting point for a channel like this, and there is a legitimate reason for making a video about a tiger. Some of you who may have been in the tank history community for long enough may have noticed that there's been a bit of a flip-flop in the narrative of the tiger. A couple years ago, it was the Tiger was the best tank of World War II. It was unmatched. The Allies just couldn't do anything against it, and the fleets of Tigers that went across Western Europe just decimated every Sherman they saw, left, right, and center. And the only reason the Germans won World War II is because they just didn't make enough of them. If you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. A time where the Ronson, lights first time every time, and it took 5 Shermans to kill a Tiger theories were unquestionable facts. But you may have noticed in the past couple of years there's been a change in narrative, and recently a lot more credit has been given to Allied equipment, especially the Sherman. So much so in fact that it's almost the Tiger now that is being relentlessly harassed for being unreliable. The gun, while being big, just wasn't that effective once the Americans and Soviets started producing heavier tanks. Sure, the Tiger was good when it debuted, but the Allies quickly caught up to it and it became obsolete almost immediately. It was too slow, it was too big, it was unreliable, its mechanics were too complex, it wasn't made in enough numbers to make any difference, or everyone reported a tank as a Tiger, but most Shermans didn't even fight Tigers, so the comparison of a Sherman versus a Tiger is meaningless. Again, if you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. So today, I wanted to take an objective look at the Tiger, taking into consideration both sides of the argument, and figure out, without bias, was the Tiger a good tank? Did it fulfill its role? Was its reliability issues as detrimental to its performance as everyone seems to make them out to be? Which side is warping reality to fit their narrative and trash the opposing side's view? Probably both, to be honest, but who knows? So, without further ado, let's just jump right into this. Now, the numerical statistics of the Tiger have been talked about to death at this point. I mean, it's probably the most famous German tank of the war after all. Pretty much everything about it has been talked to death. So I'm just going to quickly go over the necessities of what we need to look at in this video. The Panzerkampfwagen 6, I sure hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, aka the Tiger, was a response to the T-34 and KV series of tanks the Germans were encountering on the Eastern Front during Operation Barbarossa in 1941. However, the idea of a heavy breakthrough tank, the role the Tiger would be designed to fill, was in the back of the Germans' heads since 1936, and many prototype tanks that would influence the Tiger would be designed before the war even started. It wasn't until the invasion of France and the Germans encountering tanks like the B-1 Bis that had much heavier armor than the tanks that the Germans were fielding at the time, that the Tiger really started to take the shape we all know and love. Germany was looking for a mount for their 88mm cannon after realizing its anti-tank potential during their campaigns in France and North Africa, even though it was originally intended for anti-aircraft use. Seriously though, how do you design a cannon like this and say, yes, this will be used specifically to shoot down planes? We will make sure to say in our doctrine and associated documents detailing its specific function that it will be used only to shoot down planes, because that is all it will ever be good for. Okay, maybe I'm not taking direct quotes, but you get the idea.
Bruh.
After its design and testing phases with the Heinkel and Porsche companies competing for the contract to begin production, and the subsequent creation of the Frankenstein tank that is the Ferdinand, which has a fascinating story within its own rights, and if you want to learn more about it, check out this video by Potential History. Huge shout out to that guy, mad respect for everything he does. It was finally approved for service, and the first Tigers would hit the front lines in Africa in 1942, and the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union not long after. From day one, the Tiger was built to have a better gun, thicker armor, and be more maneuverable than the Panzer IIIs and IVs the Germans were fielding at the time. And while at first that might sound ridiculous, my claim for this mostly comes from this quote from Guderian himself in 1941. And although he is referring to the Panther here, it's safe to say he thought this philosophy should apply to the Tiger as well, since it was being tested at the time the statement was made. Of course, you're all free to interpret this however you like. With that in mind though, I'd say they succeeded in 2 of these 3 departments. The Germans needed a heavier tank that would be capable of dealing with the T-34s and KVs on the Eastern Front, while also maintaining the maneuverability required to sustain the mobile warfare Germany was using with outstanding success. The specific role they needed filled was that of a heavy breakthrough tank, which is basically this. The enemy has a front line. You send in these big, heavy tanks that can take the pounding of a defensive formation, while also having a big gun to wreak havoc on the toughest parts of the line. Then, once the hole is punched, the infantry and medium tanks push through and kill whatever they find. By the way, the Germans weren't the only ones to use this tactic, but this is basically blitzkrieg in a nutshell. This means, though, that the Tiger really only had one purpose: heavy breakthrough. Once the hole was punched, the Tiger wasn't really needed anymore until the next defensive line needed to be hit. So that's all the Tiger was built to do, and in that regard, they hit the nail on the head. However, the Tiger was very often used outside of doctrine, since the troops on the ground thought, well, it's a big tank with big armor and a big gun. We can use it for pretty much anything, even though most of what they put it through wasn't its designed or intended role, which may have had an effect on its performance. Although, interestingly, there are also a lot of reports that say that the Tiger was actually found to be most effective on the defense, dispersed across a wider front, quite the opposite to its intended role of a concentrated offensive breakthrough tank. However, a lot of that data probably comes from reports after Kursk, in which the Germans would officially be on the defensive, and also the fact that pretty much any heavy tank with a big gun is going to be effective when it's just sitting in place, waiting for the enemy to attack it. Defender's advantage and all that. Throughout its service life, the Tiger had above average kill-loss statistics. Not saying they were the overpowered, sent-from-God war machines wereaboos make them out to be, but to say the Tiger wasn't an effective tank killer is just wrong. Yes, the 88mm the Tiger had was very powerful for the time, and it definitely proved a deadly weapon on the field when used properly. And yes, its armor was definitely that of a heavy tank, capable of deflecting almost anything the Allies could throw at it at the time. But it wasn't perfect. Germany had a huge problem with armor manufacturing, often finding that their plates, while very thick, were too hard and could crack under sustained fire. Although this trait is mostly talked about in reference to the Panther, the Tiger suffered from this defect as well. However, of course, the Tiger wasn't faster than Panzer IIIs or IVs, and this is where most of the Tiger's shortcomings come from. The design point Ameriboos hone in on and don't let go about. The Tiger is now notoriously known: unreliability. Most people who argued the Tiger was a complete failure called to times the Tiger broke down before even making it to battle, or when the Tiger would get hit by one shell and the crew would immediately bail, or when the Tiger would get stuck in mud and the crew had to bail. And I just want to take all that and break it down real quick. No pun intended. Cases of Tigers breaking down or catching fire on the way to the fight mostly relate to the Tiger's disfigured cousin, the Ferdinand. Of course, I'm not saying it never happened to Tigers, and sure, it happened to Tigers more often than other tanks like Panzer IIIs or IVs, but it definitely didn't happen as often as it did for Panthers, Tiger IIs, Ferdinand or Elephants, and probably the Mouse if it ever got put into service. Crews bailing also happened all the time. The Germans managed to capture tons of Shermans and T-34s after their crews had abandoned them, and the biggest reason comes down to common sense. The chieftain said it best.
US and UK military did some assessments. They concluded that the winner of a fight against a Sherman or a Panther was usually whoever fired first, which has a couple of pieces of sense to it. Firstly, you are not going to open a firefight unless you are in a position of advantage to begin with. Secondly, once you do get the first shot off, you are usually calm and collected, and the guy on the receiving end is having a significant emotional event.
Imagine you're in a tank, and you get hit. There is a lot going on inside your head. And depending on your situation, how many enemies you thought there were, how many allies you thought you had with you, how much damage the hit you just took did to your tank, etc., you may just decide the best course of action is to abandon ship. And finally, to address getting stuck in the mud, literally every tank under the sun faced this issue, even the Sherman. Yes, I know, the ever-maneuverable Sherman got stuck in the mud. Even Mark IVs and Vs, which were specifically designed to cross the muds of no man's land, often found themselves getting stuck in the mud. German tanks also suffered from complexity in their designs, and most of the tanks we heckle about being unreliable are really just difficult to maintain, which isn't any better, of course. The Tiger was designed with survivability in mind. The Germans very well knew the Tiger would be a hassle to repair and maintain due to its complexity, so they tried to make sure it would break down as little as possible. Of course, this is a lot easier said than done, and they quickly got caught in a loop. In order to make the Tiger break down less, they made more advanced and complex designs. However, these designs were often so complex they broke down even more, which made the tank difficult to repair, so they had to make more advanced components and upgrades to keep it from breaking down again. This is why you often hear that the Tiger went through constant design changes, to the point where almost every half dozen Tigers that came off the production line were different in some way to the previous batch. The Germans were obsessed with perfecting the Tiger. Although this wasn't all bad. Sure, they made a lot of changes that were meaningless, but they did actually fix, or at least diminish, a lot of the mechanical problems the Tiger faced, although its design complexity never got any better. And we have to remember, the Tiger is a heavy tank. Heavier tanks means more stress on the transmission and drivetrain and pretty much every other component that makes tank go vroom. But this is a problem that literally every nation in World War II encountered. As much as we like to praise the Jumbo or Pershing for being the heavy tank the Western Front needed, or the KV and IS series of tanks for being these unkillable machines the Germans just couldn't get past, all of those tanks struggled with weight issues and being underpowered. The Jumbo and Pershing specifically are rare examples of the United States testing a tank extensively, still finding significant issues in its design. In both cases they were mostly weight related, but still sending them overseas because they just needed to get something out there. And it really doesn't take much research or tank know-how to understand why. We often forget this is the 1940s we're talking about. Cars were mass-produced for the average person to use literally 40 years ago, just before World War I. And sure, 40 years is a decent chunk of time, but the concept of the automobile was still far from perfected. And now you're taking this technology and applying it to insanely heavy war machines, you're bound to run into some problems. So as much as we like to riff on the Germans' third generation of tanks for being unreliable, every country that made tanks experienced these issues. But in the case of the United States, the Sherman was designed as a perfect platform for testing risky concepts, and pretty much any upgrades that needed to be made to it in order to account for its issues could be realistically achieved in mass, and on short notice. And for the Soviets, as soon as they found a design that worked, i.e. the T-34, they just started producing as many as they could until their shortcomings just didn't matter anymore. At the end of it all, I think we've reached a few conclusions. Was the Tiger a good heavy tank? Yes, without a doubt. Was the Tiger the war changer history has made it out to be? No, not at all. Did the Tiger effectively fulfill its role of a heavy breakthrough tank? Absolutely, and it even found some success outside of its intended role. As I said earlier, the Tiger is reported as being relied on heavily in a variety of situations, which may have actually been a good thing if they had made more of them. Is the Tiger the best tank the Germans produced during World War II? Probably not. Does the Tiger deserve all its praise? Not exactly. Its shortcomings in reliability, availability, cost, and ease of production should definitely be considered. Does the Tiger deserve all its hate? Not really. I think people get so caught up in its shortcomings they forget that the Tiger was actually really good at what it was designed to do. Allied tankers on the eastern and western fronts, as well as North Africa and Italy, upon encountering Tigers often made attempts to avoid them, or wait for heavier backup. And if the Tiger had no real effect on the battlefield, then why did the Soviets pursue the T-34-85, or the IS series? Why did the United States pursue upgrades on the Shermans to make it more effective in the anti-tank role? Because the Tiger proved a valid concern, even though the Americans never really encountered one in Western Europe.
In Northwest Europe, between D-Day and the fall of Germany in 1945, guess how many times American tankers met Tiger 1s? 4. Too many. The answer is 3. The first time the Shermans won, the second time the Pershing lost, and the third time the Tigers were getting loaded onto flat cars, so it wasn't really a fair fight.
But as with all these things, it goes both ways. Why did the Germans pursue the Panther, Jagdpanther, the Tiger II, and even the Maus? Because the IS series and T-34-85 proved threats to Tigers and Panzer IVs. And keep in mind, this is all being considered within the 1942-1944 time frame, so we're comparing this to these. Where a lot of you who see the Shermans and T-34s as legitimate threats to Tigers are probably thinking more like this. And at the end of the day, the major combatants of World War II usually didn't produce and field tanks that didn't work, or just couldn't do what they were designed to do, notable exceptions withstanding. So the next time you're browsing r/tank porn and you see someone in the comment section of a picture of some tigers in Italy going off about how amazing the tiger was, spouting the usual wereaboo crap, let him down easy. But also give him credit. Like most of the data surrounding tanks and their history, a lot of it is exaggerated. A lot of it is fake, and most of it isn't even there. So it's up to us to interpret and come to our own conclusions. So respect everyone's opinion, and just keep conversations civil. And maybe one day, wereaboos and ameraboos can live in peace.